Disregard as regard. Camera 1. Action.
Yeah. So you talked about how they would pick, these guys up for loitering and things. Were these the same officers that were working with the prisons? Like, was it they doing this type of thing together?
Yeah, it would have been. It was the same time that law enforcement were in place, and in slavery, it was the overseers, and yeah, they just took it, like she said, it just took a different form.
So I asked that to say, is that the same way today? Is the prison system still so let's say the prison needs 15 beds to sell to meet their quota. Do they talk to police officers and say, hey guys, we haven't met our quota, we need you to go out? Like, I can think, me being from Wilmington and hearing the news about the 2 officers that were arrested for their, the things that they said.
Yeah, they wanted black people locked up and think they all should be killed.
Right.
Yeah.
So are they? Do you?
Absolutely. I mean, those are things. Officers.
Not all officers.
Not all.
Right.
Yeah. The criminal legal system. So district attorneys, judges. Yeah, it's all a continuum of the criminal legal system.
So is there a group? Is there an organization? Because I just heard that New Hanover County has about 1,300 nonprofits. Is there a nonprofit? Is there a group out there that are holding the system accountable? I know you do local reentry, but is there people in place to? So for me, I used to work at Williston, and one thing that I got out of it is that one kid was getting long term suspended, and I knew the kid personally, working in the school system, and he had to go to a hearing. And so in the hearing, the first thing they said was New Hanover County Schools versus the kid's name. And I was like, they say this is a court. And it literally felt like a court atmosphere. And so me being there on the behalf of the NAACP and, just us having that knowledge, we were able to get that kid back into school. Is there an organization that does that for people that are being wrongfully convicted, like situations that are happening, like you were saying with the loitering and all that? Is there an organization that does that? Like, can we put something together? I'm asking the masses, the people, to be able so this doesn't continue to happen, because I think this is just something that we need to put in place.
So I would say statewide, one organization, certainly I would have to say that one of the advocacy is ACLU, NAACP, Forward Justice. Those are organizations I know on a statewide level that does that work. Locally, we have a Port City Second Chance Alliance, which is an advocacy group, as well as Eyes on the Law. So we have a group within our agency called Eyes on the Law that focuses on advocacy work, policy work, to they even do court watch training. Daquan Peters, he's a guy that does a lot of advocacy work that worked for Second Chance Alliance. So I would say those are just a few, but I think every nonprofit organization ought to have some hybrid or abbreviated program within their organization, especially if they're working with underserved communities, because this is a reality of underserved communities, because systems, corporations prey on people with no political influence, no political power, the underserved communities. Yeah, that's like, yeah, just like in slavery time.
Yeah, it all made sense, because you ride through some of these underserved communities, there's 6 police officers out there.
Yes, that's correct.
Wow. I'm starting to see, you are now slowly it's coming together that it is the system. You opening my eyes.
Yeah, but not blaming. We're not blaming the system. We're just holding the system accountable for them to about like me, Malik. I got into reentry work because I treated my brother, who was a Vietnam vet, that found himself struggling with a heroin addiction because of Vietnam. I used to treat him like the scum of the earth. I used to prey on the vulnerable and was his brother without thinking about, hey, how can I support you? How can I help you? So at that point, I was the system. You know what I'm saying? Because systems are made up of individuals anyway.
Wow.
So I was the system that kept beating him on his head. You ain't got no business. You just a criminal. You just a drug addict.
Right.
Went to prison because of that. So I was the system, and the only person was holding me accountable to that system was my mama. Because she's back to our first podcast. Honey, God made us all just alike.
That's right. So when you keep saying the word system, and she's saying the word system, and you guys keep saying caste system, what is it that that could help this caste system? Now I have my mentor, her name is Amy White. I have to give her a shout out. She is the greatest. She's trying to build ecosystems. Is that what helps that caste system? Is better ecosystems that are all focusing on something stronger together that could attack that system?
Yeah, in a funny kind of way.
Okay.
When you talk about caste, I'm trying to think. It's a lady, I forget the author name, who talked about caste because it's really popular in India. And caste system, if I make it relative to a place like we live here in Wilmington, it would be let me say people who live in trailer parks.
Okay.
When you say trailer parks, that typically means white people who are poor, or Mexicans, or Latinos when you say trailer park. So that's a caste. And caste typically operate in tiers. Like the elite class, caste. Those are some of the caste system. That's why she's called people in the legal system under caste. And those are the folks that, like she says, relegated to a permanent second-class citizenship. And to develop an ecosystem, as you said, that can transcend caste to create love and equality. Because love conquers all.
Yeah.
And that's when those, when we start to develop ecosystems, it's got to be love at the root, because that is what's going to, that's what's going to give us the capacity to treat people equally and to decide to be equal and hold people accountable.
I can agree with that. There we go.
Has been used once again in a manner that effectively recreates caste in America. Now, for those who find that kind of claim hard to swallow, I say consider the facts. Our prison system has quintupled in a period of about 30 years for reasons that have stunningly little to do with crime. Now, we've gone from a prison population from about 300,000 to well over 2 million. You know, we now are the world's leading, incarcerator. Yet crime rates have gone up, have gone down, today are at historical lows. You know, most criminologists and sociologists today will acknowledge crime rates and incarceration rates in the United States, they've moved independently of one another. Imprisonment rates have soared regardless of whether crime has been going up or down in any given community or the nation as a whole. And yet Black imprisonment in particular has consistently soared. It was reported several years ago that in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, 3 out of 4 young Black men and nearly all those in the poorest neighborhoods could expect to serve time in prison. Rates nearly as shocking can be found in other poor communities of color across America. So what happened? What happened? Well, the answer is a war was declared. A war was declared on poor communities of color, a Get Tough movement, and a war on drugs that has decimated poor communities of color. In fact, drug convictions have been the engine of mass incarceration and the emergence of a new racial undercast. If you take a look at the period between 1985 and 2000, nearly 2/3 of the increase in the federal system were due to drug convictions alone, and more than half of the increase in the state system was due to drug convictions alone.
Wow.
By the year 2000, there were more people returning to prison on probation and parole violations than had been locked up for all offenses in 1980. So this massive new prison system was born, and millions of people became shuttled into the system primarily for nonviolent offenses and drug-related offenses, swept into the system, branded criminals and felons, and then released into a permanent second-class status for life. Now, the drug war has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color, even though studies have now shown for decades that, contrary to popular belief, people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites. In fact, in some surveys, it indicates that white youth are actually more likely to engage in illegal drug dealing than Black youth. But that's not what you would guess by looking inside our nation's prisons and jails, which are overflowing with Black and brown drug offenders. In some states, 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison have been African American. But still, people will say to me, well, the reason we're waging the drug war in those ghetto communities, in those poor communities of color, is because that's where the violent offenders are, that's where the drug kingpins are, so it makes sense for us to be waging the war in those communities. In fact, most people assume that the war on drugs was declared in response to the emergence of crack cocaine in inner city communities and the related violence. But that's not true. It's not true. The war on drugs was officially declared by President Ronald Reagan in 1982. President Richard Nixon was the first to coin the term a war on drugs, but it was President Ronald Reagan who turned that rhetorical war into a literal one. And at the time he declared that drug war, drug crime was actually on the decline, not on the rise. It was a couple years before, not after crack first hit the streets. So why was this drug war declared? Because Ronald Reagan wanted to make good on campaign promises to get tough on a group of people who had not so subtly been defined as Black or brown in the media and the political discourse. The war on drugs and the Get Tough movement was part of a Republican Party strategy, known as the Southern Strategy, of using racially coded Get Tough appeals on issues of crime and welfare to appeal to poor and working class whites, particularly in the South, who were threatened by, resentful of, anxious about many of the gains of African Americans in the civil rights movement. Poor and working class whites, had their world rocked by the civil rights movement. Wealthy whites could send their kids to private schools and give their kids all the advantages that wealth had to offer. But it was poor and working class whites whose kids might potentially be subject to a desegregation order. It was their kids who were going to be having to compete for the first time on equal terms with this whole group of people that they've been taught their whole lives to believe were inferior to them for, decent jobs. And this anxiety and resentment was fertile ground for politicians who wanted to exploit those racial divisions. And pollsters and political strategists found that by using Get Tough rhetoric on issues of crime and welfare, that they could persuade poor and working class whites in the South to defect from the Democratic New Deal coalition and join the Republican Party in droves. Well, the Reagan administration got lucky, because a couple of years after the drug war was declared, crack hit the streets and spread to inner city communities across the country. And the Reagan administration seized on this development with glee, hiring staff whose job it was to feed stories to the media of crack babies, crack dealers, crack users, the so-called crack whores, in the hopes of turning crack into a media sensation, which they believed would bolster public support for the war and guarantee that millions more dollars would flow to waging it. And the plan worked like a charm. Almost overnight, television sets were flooded with images of, crack babies, crack users, crack dealers. And soon, Democrats began competing with Republicans to prove who could be tougher on them. And so it was President Bill Clinton who presided over the most dramatic escalation of the drug war at the same time as he ended welfare as we know it, all in an effort to appeal to that same group of white swing voters, a task that was made easier once crack had actually hit the streets and violence had become a real problem in these communities. And it was the Clinton administration who championed laws banning drug offenders from public housing and denying them even food stamps for the rest of their life.
She started talking about politics, and you know how I get. But I agree, man. Everything she said was.
But what is it? It's really no different right now. I mean,
sure.
when you look at the climate of politics, it is really using certain strategies.
Yeah.
We call it marketing.
Yeah.
In order to get elected, which has nothing to do about empowering people.
Yeah, it's a joke now. They're getting on.
But and as she just made it clear, it's always been a joke.
Yeah.
It's always been a joke. But again, the part that I just want us to, as we get ready to wrap up, man, it's all based on typically using disenfranchised communities, the ones that don't have any political influence, but they use the rhetoric in order to bolster their campaign process or policies. Yeah, it is, man, yeah, at the end of the day, man, it's sad. And we, I was about to say, and we keep getting looped into it, or I should speak for myself. I keep getting looped into it. Yeah, and man, it's so overwhelming. It almost feels hopeless. But I want to say one thing.
Go ahead.
In North Carolina, we spend a little over $2 billion on the budget for corrections.
In North Carolina alone.
North Carolina alone, $2 billion. For a person in medium custody, it's right at $135 a day. That's how much it costs us as taxpayers. Minimum custody is about $112 a day. Closed custody, which is, the heavy stuff, $158 a day. So on an average, between all of the custody levels, we spending about $134 a day to hold a little over 31,000 people in prison.
Wow. And probably about a half of them don't even need to be in prison.
Oh, I forget. I had wrote down the statistic. I don't know what I did with it, but we...
Because I would say it's like, even when I was working at the school, if we had, let's say, 20 kids in ISS, half of them didn't even need ISS. It was more or less just a conversation, or,
That's correct.
Let's just talk this out or figure out what the real problem was and go back to class. So I could definitely understand. But as we wrap up, let's kind of give the folks a overview of kind of what we talked about. I would say number one would be what mass incarceration is, which what you schooled me on today is a part of the system, and we're not blaming the system, but it's major.
We incarcerating people as we always have in mass, where the system has taken different forms as we progress through society. So one of the things that we want the folks to know, it started with slavery, and then it went to convict leasing, and then it was one after convict leasing to what we have today, which is now we incarcerate more people than any other country in the world. And it is a system unlike any other system.
Right.
And it disenfranchises primarily Black and brown people, which is 61% of the system. And typically we're only 22% of the population.
Wow.
So that's one. The second thing is the cost of incarceration.
Right.
If there are more programs like LINK, which is a reentry program, and if the system will look at more alternatives to a person going to prison, like you say, half the students then they need to be in ISS.
Correct.
So even if we're looking at programs like yours, like Navigational Studios,
Right.
sending children through your program, where you got people in leadership roles that look like they look,
Right.
that could spend them on the natural course of student success.
Correct.
And not suspension and being dismissed and disenfranchised.
Correct. And give a shout out to your guy Ben David as well with his organization. That should help.
Yes, that's correct. The new organization, right?
That's correct. That's correct. And so as we say that, I'm gonna give my last shout out to Port City United. I don't know if people have seen the news of all the schools that have exceeded growth. But a lot of those schools was Port City, and I'm just gonna toot their horn. Not saying I worked there or anything, but before I close out, I had to sneak that in.
No, I'm glad you said that. So, because, man, I'm glad you said that.
I just had to slide that in before we got up out of here.
So, but Malik, give them the facts. What the studies show is that Williston hadn't shown growth in over a decade.
Well,
until last year, which was the height of PCU being in the school.
Come on now. Come on.
Wow.
And so I think,
but again, it's that system.
That's what I was gonna say.
To dismiss, disenfranchise a group of kids that systems hadn't respected. But that's one of the things that our podcast is to say love conquers all.
That's right.
Even that barrier that hopefully people will watch this and say, hey, maybe I need to take another look at this.
That's it. That's it.
Maybe I need to take another. Man, I'm glad. That's actually a great point to end on.
Well, we might talk about that on our next episode.
That's correct.
A little sidebar.
And we are also going to invite someone to join us that has actually been in prison.
Okay.
To talk about what I'm gonna call it, the mental stress and the intrinsic violence that happens in that system that that we don't sometimes know about because we hadn't been incarcerated. But and I said that we got to have people impacted.
That's right.
That's actually ringing that bell tone.
I'm ready.
That can tell us what it's like.
I'm ready.
I've enjoyed this, bro.
Man, me too, man. That was good. We gotta stay on it. For y'all, we gonna do it. I ain't gonna promise. But we gonna do it.
Yeah, we're gonna be more consistent because people have been holding us accountable.
That's right. That's right.
So we're gonna rise to the occasion.
All right, brother.
Peace and blessings.
Next time.
Yes, sir.
Swag.